killing yourself, traveling to all these places and wrestling every night. So you need steroids, right? So you need steroids to maintain your physique. So what else do you need? You need muscle relaxers or painkillers or stuff like that. So all those guys were doing that. They go out after the fights, after the matches, and they have a few drinks, so they're drinking. And then the next morning they feel like crap. They got to get to the gym and pop their steroids or inject themselves. So what do? You use cocaine.
They listening, DA. Yeah. Everything we saying, DA.
What's good, everybody? What's up, everybody? We'd like to welcome you to the Q&DA party. Be good and be good to one another. Get comfortable, sit down and enjoy the show with your lover. Feeling good, doing well, that's the vibe that we bring. From your mic to your mind, from Cali to Maine. Q&DA, Q&DA, Q&DA. Relax and press play.
Q&DA, our long-form conversations, are available each and every week. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click on this button below me so that you are notified and become a member. Click on join above me, and members will enjoy exclusive videos like a deep dive on this conversation via yours truly with your raw feed video series on this channel. Well, you guys know, if you listen to my SiriusXM show, that we have a lot of fun around the wrestling world. I'm a very casual wrestling observer or fan. My roots in this date back to the 80s when I was a kid and maybe early 90s, but then I kind of detached. But Babs, my cohort in the mornings, is a huge wrestling fan up until today. And so I was really interested in this book because I think that there's a lot you can take away from the wrestling world that is kind of a mirror in culture, general American pop culture. And I know the author is a really talented guy. He has written for ESPN for a long time as one of their combat sports reporters. He's also covering the Falcons as well for ESPN. He specializes in MMA, mixed martial arts. So you see him there with a lot of coverage as well. And he wrote the book, Say Hello to the Bad Guys. This is the Attitude Era of professional wrestling in the 90s. Marc Raimondi joining us on the show. Marc, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. And like I said, I feel like there is a lot of imagery and reflection on this and 90s wrestling and what America was and maybe still is for that time period. And so I want to start at the beginning because this is all about Hulk Hogan in the beginning, the kind of origin story of the Attitude Era. And this massive operation that Vince McMahon undertakes to make WWF national and not just a regional thing. And kind of the big bang is 1985 when it's WrestleMania 1. And in the book, you cite that Vince McMahon had kind of leveraged everything that he had owned to make WrestleMania 1 a thing. And you had cited, and now I'm thinking back into it, that's why this book is really effective. He had Captain Lou Albano in the Cyndi Lauper Girls Just Want to Have Fun video. You have Hulk Hogan on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and I don't think that has ever happened since, wrestling on the cover of SI.
Nope.
You had SNL. I didn't even remember this, but Hulk Hogan
and Mr. T hosted it. Yep.
And Mr. T hosts SNL.
Yep.
And I thought, was the mortgaging of everything the McMahons owned money investment into getting these projects greenlit, or were those happening like tail wagging the dog or dog wagging the tail? How did all those mainstream media projects happen with wrestlers if wrestling wasn't mainstream yet?
That's a really great question, Damon, and it's a little bit of what you said. It's a little bit of the leveraging of the McMahon, family mortgage, so to speak, but also just the fact that it was a big event, and it was WrestleMania 1, and this was Vince McMahon's dream, because before, wrestling had been kind of divided up into territories, and there was a wrestling promotion in the Northeast, which was his dad's promotion. There was stuff down in Georgia, there was North Carolina, there was Texas, there was out in Los Angeles, San Francisco. It was all disjointed, and it was all territorial. And Vince McMahon Jr., his dream was to take all of those regional promotions, those territories, and bring them all together under one roof, basically, and make it a national promotion with cable television and what have you. And really, the dawn of cable and the dawn of pro wrestling as a national kind of cultural symbol went together, because wrestling and cable have gone together like peanut butter and jelly over the years, because if you need programming for your cable network, wrestling is there, and it's relatively, I guess, inexpensive compared to maybe a scripted series that takes a long time to tape and what have you, and the promotion foots the bill for production. So that's a big deal. So that was kind of like where it all converted and where it all kind of came together was WrestleMania 1, where, you know, the popularity of wrestling was coming to like a crescendo, and Vince McMahon had this dream to make it all national. And the key was Mr. T, honestly, because Hulk Hogan was a pretty well-known guy in '85. He was already on the Tonight Show, but even before he was at the WWF, he was already a pretty big name. He was on with Carson. But Mr. T was starring in the A-Team at that time, and that was the biggest show on television, or at least one of them. So that was a big key for getting the WWF onto all of these mainstream interviews and mainstream networks was the Mr. T connection, and of course the Cyndi Lauper connection as well. And that was another part of Vince McMahon's strategy. It was like, okay, well, it's funny because you think Vince McMahon and you think wrestling, right? They're synonymous, wrestling and Vince McMahon. But Vince McMahon's dream for wrestling was really more about entertainment, not wrestling. He actually felt like the old school wrestling where it's just two guys in a ring, you know, grappling with each other was passe. It was not going to take things to the next level. What he really wanted to inject into it was more spectacle and more entertainment and more Hollywood. So they hired Liberace, you know, to be like the guest timekeeper. Muhammad Ali was there to be the special guest referee. They had Billy Martin. He was the manager of the Yankees, and he was there, you know, ringside for the match. And they were just trying to get all of these luminaries from the worlds of Hollywood and sports and music together. And that's what made WrestleMania as big as it was, because it wasn't just wrestling. It was entertainment. It was Hollywood. It was glitz and glamour, and that was Vince McMahon's dream.
So it's kind of perfect for the glam 80s to have celebrity, showmanship,
Yes.
bigness, almost artificiality. That is very of the moment. But getting to that point, was there resistance from wrestling fans of kind of making it cartoonish? Because when you get to the caricatures of wrestlers, it's fun, but was there a group of fans that said that this is silly, this is childish?
Yes, absolutely there was, because there were still other wrestling promotions out there, especially down in the South in Georgia. Georgia Championship Wrestling became basically WCW, and there was Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas, and those particular territories remained for a little bit, and so did the AWA in Minnesota, and they kind of stayed as old school wrestling promotions where it was still storytelling, but it was storytelling based mostly about two guys getting into a ring and settling a grudge or going after a championship. And Vince McMahon wanted more than that. But the fans of those territories in the South and in the Midwest kind of rolled their eyes at what Vince McMahon was doing, because it was like, this is not wrestling. This is crap. You know, this is like, you know, this is entertainment. This is, you know, we want like the real stuff. Of course, there's no real stuff in pro wrestling. It's all predetermined. But they felt like their wrestling was more real than what Vince McMahon was doing. And I'll give you a great example. When I was researching this book, Damon, Ric Flair, who everyone knows, right? He's one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, one of the greatest, you know, interviews of all time. He was still wrestling down south in the Carolinas and in Georgia and a little bit in the AWA. And while this Vince McMahon thing was going on in the WWF, and, you know, he felt like Hulk Hogan was just kind of like a toy salesman. Like Hulk Hogan was not a real wrestler to Ric Flair at the time. He was just a guy that sold toys and merchandise. He wasn't, you know, a real, you know, he wasn't a real guy who got in the ring and did it. You know, he was just kind of an entertainer.
For some reference, my grandma used to love wrestling, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, she was an immigrant from Slovakia. They came to the U.S. in the 30s, and she used to love Bruno Sammartino. She used to love Jimmy Superfly Snuka. And I guess I knew at that time that even dating back to those guys, which were almost like black and white, you know, okay, wrestling is scripted. But what I didn't realize until I read your book was that the scripted nature of wrestling goes back farther than that, to the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, when carnival promoters realized just watching two guys grapple, not that interesting. But if we set up the theater of it, now people are interested. I had no idea. How aware were you of the origin of where wrestling became the sport that had become kind of theater and scripted?
Pretty aware, just because I've kind of studied wrestling for a long time, even going back before I started working on this book. But yeah, it was really the 1920s where wrestling pretty much became fake, predetermined, and it was this group that was like a traveling group of promoters called the Goldust Trio, and they were the ones that really decided like, hey, it's best for business to try to manipulate this into something that the fans, want to pay money for, rather than just letting guys go out there and have a legitimate athletic contest. Because back in the early 1900s and early 1800s, it was just kind of like, it was stuff at a carnival, and it was basically the tough guy from the carnival, from whatever the touring folks that did that, against whoever was the local tough man, and it was just a grappling match, and it was kind of boring. It was for a few minutes it was a spectacle, right, to see two guys like fight and wrestle around, but after like 30 minutes you're like, all right, let's get on with this. Like, what's going on here? And the thing that they realized is that if you make it a little bit more pleasing to the eye and a little bit more, aesthetically pleasing, and also manipulate who is going to win by who you think is going to do the best business, that's a much better plan than these wrestling on the carnivals type of thing. And, ultimately they were right, because wrestling became massive after that. It was not going to be as big if it was just, two guys grappling around, in a carnival, dirt, somewhere in middle America.
So what I also have as a frame of reference as a sports fan is that there has always been this thing about steroids in sports, and it is crescendoed at different times. But for baseball, by and large, it's the congressional hearings with Roger Clemens, Rafael Palmeiro, Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa, and all those guys kind of stonewalling Congress. But that happens well after, when wrestling is roped into this. And you kind of pinpoint that as the break point between Hulk Hogan, who is the most massive superstar in wrestling, and how he eventually gets to peel off from WWF to get to WCW for when the Attitude Era is created. That's kind of where this is. Say hello to the bad guys. So how did wrestling, which is again just theater, get kind of roped into the kids don't do this steroid thing?
Another good question. And it all started with a doctor in Pennsylvania. Now, there was a doctor who was the doctor for the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission. And back then, in the 80s and early 90s, the state athletic commissions used to regulate and sanction wrestling the same way they did boxing, and the same way they now do to the UFC and to MMA. So they were all the local governments were involved in regulating wrestling. And the WWF ran a lot of shows, a lot of their TV tapings were in Pennsylvania. And that's where this guy was the doctor. He was the doctor of the Pennsylvania Commission. And he got busted for distributing steroids. And when they looked into his books and looked into his files, they realized that he was distributing steroids specifically to WWF wrestlers. And that's how it all snowballed from there. And then once the feds got their hands on that, they went after Vince McMahon and the WWF. And I mean, look, if you look at the guys, I mean, just like, did they pass the eye test like some of the guys in the 80s and 90s, right? It was obvious those were not natural physiques, Damon. I mean, I don't think anyone, would argue that at the time. So the feds, steroids really only became illegal in the very early 90s. So it was really just after that. And the feds, I guess, tried to make Vince McMahon, kind of like a symbol at that point. They tried to make an example out of him. And that's what it was. So they went after the Athletic Commission doctor, and they went after Vince McMahon and the WWF. And they tried to get Hulk Hogan to turn on Vince McMahon with his testimony and get on the stand and go against Vince McMahon and say that Vince McMahon was distributing steroids and encouraging his wrestlers to use steroids in order to continue to get, pushed as stars.
Which actually sounds literally like a scripted storyline from WWF.
That's the thing about wrestling, Damon, and if you follow it for a long time, the stuff that happens outside the ring is actually just as crazy as stuff that's inside the ring. It's like the script writers inside the ring actually can't even come up with some of the stuff that happens outside the ring. So
did WWF or professional wrestling ever end up instituting a no steroids policy like other sports did?
Yes. So after the trial, which somehow Vince McMahon won, which no one thought he would, he was acquitted, and he did not, he did not do any jail time. They implemented a wellness policy, steroid policy, where the guys were getting tested. But again, it was a self-imposed policy. So no, there was no. It wasn't like they had like USADA, which like the Olympics uses. It was stuff the WWF did. So if someone tested positive, they could sweep it under the rug. But they did crack down, certainly, after the trial on guys and I guess women who were doing steroids. And they tried to also change a little bit of their philosophy when it came to who was getting pushed as the biggest stars of the company, because the 80s and the early 90s were all about the guys with the big muscles and the ripped abs. And in the early to mid 90s, they started to push guys like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, who were not giant 6'5" muscle men. They were more, not small guys by any stretch, and certainly bigger than the average person, but they did not look like they were giant juice heads, so to speak.
Well, we now have this unfortunate graveyard of broken down wrestlers' bodies and those that have unfortunately passed away. Was steroid use back then, or continued steroid use, is that attributed to a lot of these early deaths that wrestlers have suffered?
I do think certainly that was part of it, but there were so many things that those guys were putting in their bodies, and it's basically a vicious cycle. So the wrestler, in the 80s and the 90s, basically was, if you were in the WWF or WCW, you were traveling 300 plus days a year. You were wrestling, half the days of the year, if not more, right? So you're putting your body through this pounding every day. And then you're driving to the next city, or you're getting on a flight to the next city. You get there in the morning, you have to go to the gym because you're on television or in front of 15,000 people in your underwear. So you have to look good, right? So you're in the gym, and at some point, when is that not enough for you, because you're killing yourself, traveling to all these places and wrestling every night. So you need steroids, right? So you need steroids to maintain your physique, right? So you're doing all this, but then also, you're taking these bumps, and you're getting hit in the head with a chair, and you're getting, beat up every night. So what else do you need? You need muscle relaxers or painkillers or stuff like that. So all those guys were doing that. So it's steroids, it's painkillers, and then they go out after the fights, after the matches, and they have a few drinks, so they're drinking, and then the next morning they feel like crap, right? Because they had their muscle relaxers, they had drinks, they got to get to the gym and pop their steroids or inject themselves. So what do? You use cocaine, right? So you use cocaine to get yourself back up again for the gym and for the match, and go on to the next city, and you do it all again with the painkillers and the muscle relaxers and whatever else, the alcohol and all those. I mean, I would say the majority of wrestlers in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s were all doing either all of those things or at least some of those things, and that there's a very short shelf life for someone who is doing that and putting that kind of stuff in your body, on top of also getting bumped around in a ring 5 nights out of the week. Like, I mean, it's just a crazy lifestyle, and that has changed a lot in this era of wrestling, where those demands are not being placed on wrestlers, because it was truly inhumane, because if they were not showing up to the next show, they weren't getting paid. And if you don't look good, you're not going to get pushed as a star. So you need to take steroids. So it was just like all these compounding things, and just so many wrestlers died young in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s too, because of the after effects from that period of time. And I'm glad that things are different now, but it was as a wrestling fan, and you're seeing, you're wondering what is going, some of these guys that I love watching as a kid, and they're dying at 38 years old. It's like, what is going on here?
Absolutely. Wow, that is fascinating. So Say Hello to the Bad Guys is then that foray into formerly good guys becoming bad guys, heels. And Hulk Hogan, as Hollywood Hogan, is kind of the best example of that. And I was reading this and I was wondering, when you think about the 80s, you think of this glossy, glamorous artificiality of maybe music and television, movies. Let's just keep it in music. And it's like MC Hammer closes out the 80s and early 90s, New Kids on the Block, really stylized, flashy.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, Milli Vanilli, which is like all substance or all style, no substance. And then you get to the 90s and we look at Kurt Cobain and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and grunge as the exact antithesis that the audience was craving authenticity and maybe, quote unquote, the bad guys. Mm-hmm. Is there a similarity or a metaphor there, a parallel between wrestling fans and why this era took off in the 90s after the 80s?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And I would throw, gangster rap in there as well, NWA and Dr. Dre and that whole period of time, Ice Cube. They really became very, very big in the early to mid 90s, that whole movement, right? West Coast rap, Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. also mid 90s, massive. And yes, there's absolutely there's absolutely a parallel, Damon, because I feel that pro wrestling is so unique in that it almost always mirrors what's going on in the real world, and it can capture that zeitgeist more than other entertainment forms can, because it's live television every week. And it's not a television series where they write the script, they film it, and then it airs in a year or 18 months, and it's dated almost. In wrestling, they're live and they can pull things from what's happening in current events right there on the screen in front of you, and it's live in front of a crowd that gives feedback. So if the crowd likes something, they cheer it, right? And then you continue doing it. If the crowd doesn't like something, it's silent or there's boos, then you try to adapt. And there's no other medium like that. And that's why I think wrestling has been so good at kind of capturing people's imaginations as far as what's going on in the moment. And the NWO and that WCW period in 96, 97, 98, it was running so parallel to what was happening in the real world that it became part of the cultural zeitgeist, and everyone was wearing NWO shirts. The NWO also became kind of the symbol of the mid 90s rebelliousness and rooting for the anti-hero, whereas the 90s changed so much as far as our feelings as Americans, because the 80s was a good time. The economy was good. It was, the yuppie movement and Reagan was the president. And then the 90s comes in and there's a recession and, the music is changing. The feeling is changing. There was the Oklahoma City bombing. And by the way, like, all these horrible things were in front of us. The Menendez brothers trial was on television. The O.J. Simpson trial. I remember, Damon, watching the O.J. Simpson trial on television every day with my mom. And it's like, I was a kid and I was watching like this incredible star athlete who had just allegedly murdered two people. And it was like all this reality, all this, like, the real world was really coming into perspective in the 90s. And wrestling went with that. And the NWO was like that. It went from the cartoon violence of like the early 90s wrestling to guys are getting beat up backstage with baseball bats, and people are getting, power bombed off of a stage into tables. And it was like a gang, it was very much of the time. And that's why I think wrestling can do it better than other mediums, because it's live every week and they can pull from all these, different current events.
So my roommate in college, my buddy Rich from high school, he was so into wrestling. Every single night he was watching these things, and I was just not into wrestling as much. So I'm just like, wow, Rich, you're really watching wrestling again. And he was all in on the Attitude Era, all in. Now he's a college student, and he's just like, even alone, he's just like totally locked in. And I thought to myself, and he's watching WCW. Like, in my frame of reference, it's, if you were going to be locked into wrestling, it would have to be WWF/WWE. Was Vince McMahon getting spooked that so much market share was now going to Hollywood Hogan, NWO, and WCW?
I don't know if I would say scared, but there was absolutely a concern about it, because now this is still post-steroid trial, and even though he won, he was not found guilty of distributing steroids. They took a massive PR hit because of that trial, and also a financial hit because they spent all that money on lawyers. You're going up against the feds. You gotta spend all that money on lawyers, and they lose Hogan, they lose Macho Man to WCW, and then they lose Hall and Nash, which were in some ways even bigger than losing Hogan and Savage, because Hogan and Savage were already kind of past their primes at that point, although Hogan kind of Like, he reinvented himself in the NWO. But Hall and Nash were very much in their primes, and they were pushed as top guys. And to lose all those wrestlers to WCW at the Ted Turner was a massive blow. And that was something that Vince McMahon complained about. He was like, Ted Turner is buying up all my talent. I built all these guys up, and Ted Turner is stealing them. And to which people would say, well, Vince, you did the same thing when it was all territorial, right? You took all the stars from all across the country and you brought them into your own thing. They were already stars elsewhere. So it was it's funny how like the cycle works in wrestling, but that was a real concern because in the ratings on Monday nights, WCW was winning. They won 83 weeks in a row, and no one had ever beaten Vince McMahon before since WWF went national.
So this boom for WCW 95, 96, 97, 98, how does it end? How does the WWE wrestle back, pardon the pun, the control of Monday nights and the culture and the market?
So WCW went grittier, right? They went edgier. They became very much mid-90s. They got darker. It was a lot of, black clothing, black leather, beat downs backstage, baseball bats, weapons, steel chairs. They got much grittier and violent than what WWF was doing. So to counter that, how do you counter when someone, does, kind of, turns things on its ear like that? You have to cross the line even further. And that's what the WWF did. They went even harder in the direction of what they thought the fans wanted, which was, even more violence, blood, more, half-naked women on the screen. It got really raunchy. WCW never did that, but the WWF said, well, our demographic is young men. It was men from, 13 or even, from that age until in their 40s, and that's what they wanted. They wanted, more violence. They wanted more, good-looking women on the screen. They wanted more reality, and that's what they were given. They were given, D-Generation X, which was basically like a group of guys that were very sophomoric and very irreverent. They started the crotch chop move. That's what they were doing in the WWF, and they really pushed the boundaries in a way that WCW then was not able to do, because WCW was still, owned by Turner, and then they merged with AOL and Time Warner, and it was very corporate. So they could not go to the lengths that Vince McMahon ended up going, and that's what ultimately won WWF the war. Is Stone Cold Steve Austin flipping the double bird, all the cursing and the misogyny and the violence is what won WWF that war ultimately.
So really, this book is about a moment in time and why the moment in time happened more than anything, and all the kind of the confluence of events that lead up to that moment in time.
And how the moment in time still kind of impacts us today in some ways as well.
And so talk to our audience about that. How does the late 90s Attitude Era still impact a wrestling audience and maybe culture in general today?
Yep. So the way that I feel, and this is kind of the book's hypothesis, is that period of wrestling in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s, was so popular. It became part of the zeitgeist. I mean, you're probably a little bit around my age, Damon, so you probably remember going outside during those days in like 1998 and seeing Austin 316 shirts, like, right, at the mall.
Absolutely.
Or, NWO shirts, like, and they were all over, and it was such a part of pop culture. And it was easier then because there wasn't as many things going on, right? There was no internet really like the way that we have it now, no social media. And that really became part of just the society that we lived in. And I mean, there were more than 10 million people watching both shows combined on Monday nights. And those people,
for reference,
now,
that is a great audience for an NBA Finals game today.
Yeah.
I mean, the NBA Finals is getting like 8 or 9 million. Imagine that as many people watching the NBA Finals are watching wrestling on a Monday night on cable.
Correct. And all those things that I mentioned that the WWF was doing and WCW were doing, that was what, we were all watching as kids. And when the NWO started, I was 11. And, and then I got a little older and I was still consuming it as a 13, 14, 15-year-old. And these are formative periods, in your life as a young man, as a teenager. And now all of us who watch, myself included, are adults. We're in our 30s, I'm 40, and, or a little bit older, a little bit younger. You get what I'm saying? And now we're all kind of like in the workforce, and we're kind of doing whatever it is we're doing, whether we're, writers or musicians or artists or lawyers or doctors. And the wrestling that we grew up on, we brought with us as adults, and that has become part of us, and therefore it's become part of society. Because how do you penetrate, society and culture? You penetrate the people that are involved in society and culture. And that's how I think that we've gotten to the point where, Donald Trump is a WWE Hall of Famer, and he used a lot of professional wrestling strategy in his speeches and in his communication, his messaging. And he's been involved with wrestling since the 80s, since the Hulkamania days, hosting shows at Atlantic City casinos. And if you look around at who some of the biggest musical artists are in the world, they've been influenced by wrestling. I always go back to Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was influenced by the wrestler Gorgeous George in the 50s and 60s. His whole persona, I'm so pretty, full like a butterfly, sting like a bee, that comes a lot from wrestling. Mike Tyson was influenced by wrestling. A lot of the UFC fighters today are influenced by wrestling. And Joel Embiid is getting fined for doing the crotch chop in the NBA games. And I don't even know if he was alive, when D-Generation X was doing that in 1998. And it's like, this is now just part of America. That 90s period of time where wrestling was so big and 10 million people were watching, that has now just become, kind of indelible to our culture inside of us. And I think a lot of us, I even see it in, social media, Damon. Like, to me, all these social media influencers, this is not real. These people are putting on a persona. They're putting on a character. They're using their real names, but they're playing someone else on social media the way that pro wrestlers play, someone else on television every week. And, you see it even in sports, you're well known in sports. And, what is the biggest shows, what are the biggest shows right now in sports? It's the talking head shows, right? It's the conflict. That's what wrestling is. It's like these conflicts that get, hashed out. Stephen A. Smith is cutting a promo on Mad Dog, on Wednesdays on First Take. These guys are cutting pro wrestling promos. And I actually interviewed Andrew Yang. Remember, he ran for president a few years ago. And I interviewed him for the book. And he admitted, like, when he went out there in front of a crowd, and he was a wrestling fan growing up, he was trying to channel his best, like, pro wrestling promo to go out there in front of the crowd and deliver it to them. And that's kind of, and he said that in order to understand Trump, you need to kind of understand pro wrestling. And I think it's good for everyone to kind of understand, what pro wrestling is and how it can. And one of the lines in the book that I'm kind of most proud of is that, like, everyone in the 90s, there was all these, like, PSAs like, hey, don't let your kids, like, do these wrestling moves, right? They're very dangerous. Don't let them, this is, they're trained professionals. Don't see what, don't do what you see on TV. And it turns out that we didn't actually copy the moves. We copied the manipulation of the masses. We copied the way that we talk in front of people. We copied the way that we talk in front of crowds. And I think that has touched a lot of people in the country, from media to politics to sports to music and so on and so forth.
That's a really insightful commentary, because you're right. Sports is a good looking glass through all this, and showmanship in sports and showmanship via social media. And when you mention Stephen A. or somebody like Pat McAfee, they absolutely conjure in sports media that wrestling, bravado, boastfulness, over the topness, and it cuts through in a clutter of noise. How do you cut through? You got to be able to grab somebody through that camera, and the art of the wrestling, like you said, promo is the way to do it. That's really interesting.
I mean, Pat McAfee is on WWE every week, and Tyrese Halliburton, one of the biggest stars in the NBA, is a massive pro wrestling fan. He wore wrestling sneakers during the NBA Finals, putting up big numbers. I mean, it's really everywhere. If you're receptive to it, right? You can see it. Sometimes people don't understand or don't kind of block it out, and almost don't give wrestling the credit that it should be given, because there's a stigma against it. It's kind of like, oh, well, it's fake. It's not. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it is. It's predetermined. No one is arguing with you with that. No one is saying that it's not, that it's a real sport, but it's not so much that it's a real sport. It's the real ways that it has effect and influence on people and our culture.
And look, the most indelible moment of the NBA playoffs is Tyrese Halliburton's choke sign. which is absolutely, a derivative of exactly what we're talking about, the showmanship that he knows from wrestling. The book is called Say Hello to the Bad Guys, and Marc Raimondi is the author, and this is available coming out June 24th, so it's a really good buy for the summer, going out to the lake, going out to the ocean, sitting around the pool. You want to go backyard book. As I said to Mark before we got on the air here, I'm not a wrestling guy by trade, but this was a really easy read. It was a really cool read because it talks a lot about culture, and also it's written for the audience that doesn't know a lot about wrestling, such as myself, that has some benchmarks, but kind of needs more of the background and context. And it's not like sometimes wrestling audience goes, you idiots, you don't know anything about wrestling. And instead, this book is not like that. It's the opposite. It's, you might not know a lot about wrestling. Let me take you inside. This is what all these terms mean. This is what all these phrases mean. And that's pretty good. So you did a great job with this, Mark. I appreciate you joining us today.
So
good job
Damon,
today. And good luck
really
with the book.
Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, my pleasure. Next time we have you on, we'll talk about whether you're going to see Kirk Cousins in training camp.
I can talk about that all day, too.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
Great job. Hey, thanks for watching, everybody. For a deep dive on this conversation, make sure you are a member. Join above or use that URL in the description of this video or the channel. That way you get my members-only series raw feed as I dig into each one of these Q&DA conversations, including today. Thanks for watching. Make sure you are subscribed, and I will see you next week for the next Q&DA. We'll see you next week. I'm DA, Damon Amendolara. Thanks for watching, everybody.